Hi, everyone. It's good to be back. And we're going to be starting just a short study looking at the Trinity. But I need to give you just a little bit of background on why this is a subject that I'm very keen to share with you. So, a number of years ago, uh, nearly 4 years, I preached a Christmas message on the incarnation, that is, God becoming human. And it's the first sermon where completely spontaneously I got a standing ovation from the congregation. And a number of people in the congregation said that they actually saw this huge Jesus standing behind me on the stage. And that really inspired me. It really got me stirred up. So I just want to begin. I'm not going to do a deep theological, intellectual discussion on the doctrine of the Trinity. I really want to start and keep my focus on Jesus, because as far as I'm concerned, what gives the cross of Christ its weight and import is who it was that died on that cross. So I've entitled this Celebrating the Person of Jesus, perhaps the greatest ever miracle. I've heard so many Christians, believers and non-believers alike, suggest that we should give up celebrating Christmas. And I completely understand that it has been hijacked. It's been hugely commercialized. But I believe that the way forward is not to abandon Christmas, but to reclaim it. I believe that Christmas and Easter are bookends of Christian faith and understanding. And if you only have the one that you mark out and celebrate, then you're only celebrating half of the truth of the gospel. So the miracle of Christmas represents to me something so breathtaking in its claims that my celebration of joy should be even greater than it currently is, not less. So what we now discuss as the doctrine of the Trinity is all fueled by the words of Jesus, the claims that he made concerning himself, but also the testimony of those who knew him. Everything that was previously understood about the nature of God, and we will look at that in this session today, had to be reconsidered in light of the person of Christ. He is the key to rightly understanding who God is and what God is. So I want to begin back in the Old Testament. Not a huge in-depth study, but just some pertinent verses that explain why the Jews found it so difficult to receive and accept Jesus when he arrived on the planet. First of all, the Jewish concept of God, the word for holy in the Hebrew language means cut, which means separated from. Their whole view and idea of God was that he was so holy, so other than human minds could conceive and understand, that when Jesus began to make the claims that he did concerning himself, they were massively offended. So Exodus 20, verse 5, God is speaking about other gods, and he says, "You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." And again in Exodus 34:14, the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Joshua 24:19, Joshua said to the people, "You will not be able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God." So Joshua there prophesying really that the history of Israel was going to be one of backsliding and turning away from God, because the human heart could not serve God the way that he must be served, which is with a wholeness of love and energy and commitment that comes from the whole of the mind, the whole of the heart, the whole of the soul, and all of the body's physical strength. In Isaiah 42, verse 8, the Lord says, "I am the Lord, that is my name, and I will not give my glory to another." Some translations say, "I will not share my glory with another." And that notion is repeated again in Isaiah 48:11. "For my own sake, I will act. For how can my name be profaned? My glory I will not give to another." I think it's important to note from our readings in the New Testament just how comfortable Jesus was regarding making himself equal with God, declaring that he and the Father were one. And while in the Old Testament, God said he would not share his glory with another, God does not seem to mind in the least sharing his glory with Jesus. In fact, reading the gospel message, you would have to say that it looks as though the Father loves to glorify Jesus and to exalt him in the eyes of men and women. So the New Testament writers, those who experienced Jesus, who listened to his teachings, who interacted with him every single day, had to wrestle afresh with their understanding of who is God. In the light of everything they'd seen in Jesus and heard from him, they had to re-question, who is this God? How do we understand him? So, as a first step in our exploration of God, the Trinity, we need to focus on understanding who is Jesus, because he is the one who caused those initial questions. How have we got God so right and yet so utterly wrong? After the resurrection, Jesus appears to the disciples in John 20, verses 27 and 28. Jesus has already appeared to the disciples, but Thomas was absent on those appearances. But on this occasion, Thomas is present. So Jesus says to him, in light of Thomas says, "Unless I can see him and put my hands in his wounds, I will not believe." So Jesus says to Thomas, reach here with your finger and see my hands, and reach here with your hand and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Thomas, a good Jew, looks at a resurrected man, a miracle, but still a resurrected man, still bearing the wounds of crucifixion. And he says, my Lord and my God. I want to read some testimonies by Christian writers from down through the ages, because I want to kind of stimulate not just your thinking, but also your heart to consider and contemplate the miracle that is Christmas. Jesus as fully God, fully man. So C.S. Lewis says, once in our world, a stable had something in it that was bigger than our whole world. C.S. Lewis, of course, a fantastic writer, and I still love the Narnia Chronicles. I know they're kids' books, but I can dip into them again and again and again, and I just find them so refreshing. His creativity, his imagination in those books. And he expresses it here about the real world, that there was something happened in a stable in Bethlehem that was so incomprehensible that it goes beyond all that his creative imagination could come up with or cope with. Once in our world, a stable had something in it that was bigger than our whole world. And then the hinge of history is on the door of a Bethlehem stable. In terms of how, as human beings, we now measure our human history, we talk of things that happened before Christ, before God became human, and then things that happened after that event. It is the fulcrum around which the change, the great change in human history, is actually measured. The hinge of history is on the door of a Bethlehem stable. And then of Jesus, this is by St. Augustine. He was created of a mother whom he created. He was carried by hands that he formed. He cried in the manger in wordless infancy. He, the Word, without whom all human eloquence is mute. J.I. Packer. The Almighty appeared on earth as a helpless human baby, needing to be fed and changed and taught to talk like any other child. The more you think about it, the more staggering it gets. Nothing in fiction is so fantastic as this truth of the incarnation, the Almighty, the invisible God, the eternal creator of this vast universe, as a helpless human baby. Charles Spurgeon, the great 19th century Baptist preacher, says, infinite and an infant, eternal and yet born of a woman, almighty and yet hanging on a woman's breast, supporting a universe and yet needing to be carried in a mother's arms, king of angels, and yet the reputed son of Joseph, heir of all things, and yet the carpenter's despised son. And from John R. Rice, you can never truly enjoy Christmas until you can look up into your Father's face and tell him you have received his Christmas gift. But I do wonder sometimes how much we understand of the sheer wonder of the Christmas gift that came in human form, as a human being, as a weak infant, given to humankind. From the Bible itself, Matthew 4, verses 15 and 16. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. A light has dawned. A new understanding, a new insight into the sheer wonder and marvel of God himself, that he would visit this planet not in some intimidating, glorious form, and not just as an infant, but as a poor, despised infant. Christmas is good news if we really understand how deeply miraculous and awesome the event is. So, in John's Gospel, John chapter 1, John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was God. When I was doing my divinity degree at New College in Edinburgh University, I did Greek and Hebrew alongside my New Testament and Old Testament studies. And we had to translate out passages of John's Gospel and then passages from the book of Romans as part of our Greek studies. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Greek word theos there. Theos can mean any God, basically. And so the New Testament writers when they wanted to explain that this was the one sovereign God they were talking about, would use the definite article. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the God, and the Word was the God. Not as the Jehovah's Witnesses have, just a mighty being. They use the Greek word theos there in the Greek text that the Jehovah's Witnesses use. An obscure Greek text, the main Greek texts that we have use the word theos with the definite article, the God. The Word was the God. And then in verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, the one that cannot be replicated, the one that cannot be imitated, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. These writers recognized, John recognized, that in Jesus he had encountered something that he had never encountered before. Something that was so awesome, so beyond human comprehension, something so beyond human imagination, that he had to take stock of everything that he had come to believe about the God of Israel. The most startling claim of the New Testament church was then and remains that God became human. Jesus is fully human. He is also fully God, fully divine. When I was translating out John's Gospel, I came across a piece of writing in the Jewish Talmud, that is rabbinical writings. And it said, in the beginning was Torah, and Torah, or the law, was with God. But it stopped there. The Jewish writers knew that God was more than Torah. Torah was hugely important, but it was not God. But for the New Testament gospel writers, they knew that the Word was more than just something that existed with and alongside God. The Word was God, the God. So then I started to read some of the Talmudic and Midrashic writings of the rabbis of the period. And I came across a discussion. It ran to about 200 pages of discussion on Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Hundreds of pages discussing how close the Spirit of God came to the waters without actually touching them. And when you start to think about the Old Testament revelation of God's absolute holiness, his separateness, his uniqueness, we might agree that that level of discussion is justified. We know that God created the world. We know he loves the world. We know he is committed to its sustenance and its ongoing development. But in these rabbis' thoughts, God could never have touched it because he was so holy. So then I started to get into the Old Testament revelation. So in Exodus 25:22, God says there, I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim which are upon the ark of the testimony, I will speak to you about all that I will give you in the commandment for the sons of Israel. From above the mercy seat. Number 7, verse 89. Testimony of Moses, the voice speaking to him from above the mercy seat. And Psalm 81. So I'm just giving you a flavor of a theme that runs all through the Old Testament. You who are enthroned above the cherubim. So the Ark of the Covenant with the cherubim, the two angelic beings with their wings outstretched over it, covering it, and God rests above, not on, but above. He doesn't touch. So we can understand why the Jewish mind struggled to grasp that God might actually not so much become a part of his creation, but even touch it because of his extreme holiness and otherness. And then in Greek philosophy, the writer Plato, something that is called Platonic dualism. Plato held that the true perfect world was a world of spirit. Spirit and material things could not mix. They were incompatible. Because the material world, which includes human life and human experience, were observably imperfect, Plato and others came up with an idea that the world was not made by the one true spirit being, but by what they called a demiurge, a spiritual being appointed by the Supreme Spirit to undertake the work of creation. But it says the Word became flesh. The Word became that which the Word had created. The Word became eternally part of what it had formed and fashioned, not sitting above it, not sitting separate from it, but part of it. That just makes me want to sit in awesome worship. The writers of the New Testament, following their encounter with Jesus, had no difficulty marrying together the Supreme Spirit of the one true holy God and the human being who was Jesus Christ. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, the writer says, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. The Son, sustaining all things by his powerful word. The Son, the exact representation, not coming so close as almost to touch, but the exact representation of the being, the eternal, holy being, the incomprehensible, infinite being of the one true God. And the Son, sustaining, upholding the whole universe by his powerful word. And in the next chapter in Hebrews, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared fully, completely in their humanity. For this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way. He had to be made like them, fully human, just as human as you are, just as human as I am. At one and the same time, in control of all things, and at the same time subject to all the shifts and changes of normal human life. The ups and downs, the hunger, the thirst, the weariness, the tiredness, the betrayal, the word, the true word, misunderstood and misrepresented. The Son is the image of the invisible God. In the Old Testament, where God said to Israel, do not make any image, because there was no image that could capture his being. Now the Son is the accepted image, the visible representation of all that God is. And then in Colossians, he goes on in 19 to 20, verses 19, Colossians 1, verses 19 to 20. God was pleased, very relaxed about having all the fullness of the Godhead dwell bodily in Jesus. God was pleased, not offended by an image that failed to capture and present him perfectly, but completely comfortable with the knowledge that the man Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the God-man, perfectly represented all that God is in human form. The incarnation, that God became fully human, is an astounding thing to say, to claim. It should either silence us in devoted worship or make us utterly affronted at this absurd claim. But I prefer to take it as God intended it. I have come to bring you good news, the most joyous news the world has ever heard. and it is for everyone, everywhere. For today in Bethlehem, a rescuer was born for you. He is the Lord Yahweh, the Messiah. I'm reading from the Passion Translation. He is the Lord Yahweh. Not he was created by the Lord Yahweh, fashioned a mere outward form like a cloak God might throw around himself. But he is the Lord Yahweh, the unspeakable, fully human, entering into all human distress as a lover and a rescuer. Sorry, I'm just getting into this. I could go on and on and on, but I'm going to stop there for this one. But I hope that something of the impact of just this consideration of who Jesus is will give you an understanding into why the early Christian writers and Christian thinkers wrestled to get a grasp of, well, what does all this tell us about who God is? He is different from, more than we have ever considered him to be. And it was taking Jesus that they began to develop a deeper understanding of and appreciation of who all that God is. Father, we worship you. We worship you and thank you. Thank you for coming close, for touching, for becoming part of our world, our life.